Right, hello to everyone coming in. We're just going to wait another minute or two and then we'll get started. All right. So hello, everyone. Good morning to those of you joining us from the US and good day to everyone else joining from everywhere else. So on behalf of 38 North and the Stimson Center, I'm pleased to welcome you to today's webinar. My name is Natalia Slavny. I'm a research associate at the Stimson Center and assistant editor for 38 North, a web journal that provides policy and technical analysis on North Korea. So North Korea is often characterized as a nation rife with extreme censorship and oppressive restrictions on information. And this has persisted under its current leader, Kim Jong-un, who has enacted severe measures of surveillance and punishment that can result in even imprisonment, forced labor, or death. So that's why today's event is so relevant. We're going to be looking into how North Koreans are circumventing these obstacles despite the risks, and also see how outside organizations can better facilitate access and dissemination of foreign information in North Korea. So we're going to be highlighting two recent reports that discuss North Korean information control on illicit foreign content, evidence of pushback by its citizens, and how foreign information is used and disseminated in North Korea, and how the state's information controls are adapting. Both reports were made possible by generous support of the National Endowment for Democracy. So our speakers today are Martin Williams, fellow at the Stimson Center and 38 North, who co-authored the report with Niklaus Scheiss entitled Project Reveal, New Research into North Korea's Digital Control System, which was published by Lumen, a nonprofit organization committed to sharing information to North Korean people through careful research, innovative technologies, and thoughtful partnerships. Martin's primary research interests are in North Korean technology, infrastructure, broadcasting systems, and propaganda. And he launched the 38 North affiliate website, North Korea Tech, in 2010, and has closely followed the country's steps onto the global internet. And we also have Peter Ward and Stephen Denny to discuss their recently published report, Information Dissemination in North Korea, a report for NGOs. So Peter Ward is a writer and researcher focusing on the North Korean economy and North Korean migration issues. He's a doctoral candidate at the University of Vienna, and his dissertation concerns the North Korean military, its role in the state's economy, and the impact this role has had on civil-military relations. And Stephen Denny is a lecturer for the chair of East Asian Economy and Society in the Department of East Asia Studies at the University of Vienna. He researches and teaches in the fields of comparative political economy and citizenship and migration, and holds a PhD in political science from the University of Toronto. So before we dive in, I'd like to let everyone know that if you have any questions that you would like our speakers to address later on, please feel free to put them into the Q&A box at any time, and we'll look at them later. So let's get started. We'll begin with some short presentations from our speakers, and I'd like to start with Martin. So Martin, the floor is yours.
Thanks very much, Natalia. Good morning, and thanks to everyone for joining us today. I'd love to give as much time as possible to Q&A, so I'm just going to dive straight in and talk about the research that we're publishing this morning. The Reveal project began in February 2020, literally a week before global lockdown and COVID. Our goal was to update and advance what we already knew about the way that North Korea restricts access to information in the digital realm. Over the last few years, my co-author on this report, Niklaus Scheiss at ERNW in Germany, and his colleagues had mapped out a system that effectively locked down Android smartphones so that they had become little more than consumption devices for state propaganda. But they hadn't looked at any recent cell phones, and that's one of the things we wanted to do with this report. For those of you that don't know the ins and outs of this system, I'll go over very briefly how it works. North Korea, as you probably know, is the most closed-off country on earth. With the exception of a handful of official uses, there's no international communications. Internet access also is simply not available to anyone. It's not like other countries where, if you use a VPN or something, you can get around a firewall or something like that. There simply is no connection in the first place for most North Koreans. Add to that foreign media is also blocked. And it means that the government goes to great lengths to ensure that citizens only get to hear the state-approved message and don't get exposed to anything else. In the digital realm, in the smartphone realm, the center of their control system is based around digital certificates. And that means that any app or movie or music or anything downloaded to a phone needs a digital certificate on it. The certificate is issued by the government. If the content doesn't have the certificate, the phone automatically deletes it. So that means that, for any of the movies and TV shows that are smuggled in from overseas, smartphones can't be used to play those because of the certificate system. Now, it wasn't always this way in North Korea. In the early days of cell phones, smartphones could be used to play anything. And citizens were using them to watch these movies and TV shows that had come into the country from overseas. But the government caught on to smartphones being used in this way. And that's when they wrote this certificate system and forced smartphone users to update the phones. Looking back, it was one of the first examples of a sort of cat and mouse between the state and citizens, whereby a technology is introduced and then citizens find an unintended way to use it, and then the government later changes or updates it in some way to prevent them, the citizens, from using it in that unintended way and to get it back to being used just in the way that the government intends. Coming more up to date, and one example that we write about in the report and we looked at is Wi-Fi. So again, back in the early days of smartphones, Wi-Fi was available on all smartphones. I don't think the North Koreans had ever disabled Wi-Fi because there were no networks that it could be connected to. So it really was a sort of useless function for most people. But then at least one foreign embassy in Pyongyang established an open Wi-Fi access point that had an internet connection. And word spread among citizens. And within a few months, the authorities had ordered embassies to switch off their Wi-Fi access points. And then in subsequent cell phones from that time, we saw that Wi-Fi had been completely disabled. But now Wi-Fi is back. Over the last couple of years, at least one new Wi-Fi network has been launched in Pyongyang that we know about. And the state has engineered a way to heavily control it. We looked at a North Korean tablet computer that is able to access this Wi-Fi network and examine the app that's used for it. All of the details in the report, but in short, you have to have a handset that's been approved for use on the network, and you have to have a SIM card for the network, and then you have to put in a username and a password. So there's 4 things that you need before you can get onto this Wi-Fi network. And all of this is hard-coded into your phone. There's an app in the phone for this Wi-Fi network. So that app only works for that network. You can't use it to connect to any other Wi-Fi that might be available. So it's another example of this cat and mouse. Citizens found a way to use Wi-Fi to their advantage. The state shut it off, and then now they've reintroduced it with more security. So we're going to watch what happens with subsequent rollouts of Wi-Fi. As I say, we know of at least one network, but there could be more by now. North Korea is still stuck on 3G data for cellular, so Wi-Fi actually offers a significant speed increase and significant advantages over cellular that, maybe it doesn't in many other countries at the moment. So we think there's going to be more Wi-Fi, but it's probably also going to be similarly locked down and very much controlled by the government. One of the other things we found during our research, in addition to this tablet that we examined, was a fairly recent model North Korean smartphone. It was a Pyongyang 2425 phone, which came out sometime in late 2018 or early 2019. It's a reasonably nice mid-market Android phone that comes from a large Chinese cell phone maker, and is still to this day one of the most modern phones in North Korea because since COVID began, about a year after this phone came out, North Korea shut off imports, so we don't believe in the last 2 years any new phones have launched in the country. When my colleague Nick Klaus in Germany started examining it, we had a problem. He was connecting it to his computer and just couldn't access the phone. There was no way for him to read the data inside the phone because the USB connection wasn't working. And at first we thought maybe we just had a bad phone or something like that. But then while we were looking into this, we met a North Korean escapee who'd been a computer programmer in China. He'd worked for the North Korean government at a North Korean company in China. And he told us that when he was back in North Korea after his time in China, he was managing to get around the security system on the phones by using a Chinese routing app. Routing is something similar to jailbreaking on iPhones, and it allows users to access the phone and get a deeper level of access than a normal user would. And using that access, you can do a lot more with the phone than you normally could. So he was using the USB connection on his phone to load this app and then to get around the security functions to enable him to watch content on his phone. So we wondered whether this was, another part of this cat and mouse game. Had USB purposely been disabled on this phone as a response to what him and his colleagues were doing? But this was just kind of a theory when we first spoke to him. But we started asking around, and soon after we interviewed a second North Korean escapee, and he told us a similar story. He wasn't a sort of computer scientist working, but he was a student of computer science at Kim Il-sung University. And he said that he and his friends were breaking into phones using essentially the same methods. And what was important was that these two people we interviewed didn't know each other. So they weren't sort of funneling information back and forth. These were two independent examples of people doing the same thing. So this started to back up the idea that perhaps this method of hacking into these phones was becoming a little bit more widespread. And then I think the best confirmation we got that it was becoming an issue was in early 2020 from the North Korean state themselves. They published a new law, the Reactionary Ideology and Culture Law. And in that law, there's now a specific prohibition against mobile phone manipulation software. So two important things, I think, here. The first is that for this to be included in a new law, we think it must have risen to the level of being something that's worrisome for the authorities. And if it's just literally one or two people doing it, I don't think it will be at that level. So it's probably happening on a slightly wider base than just these two people we spoke to. Also, the second most important thing, I think, or the second important thing, is that for the first time, we're seeing evidence of a relatively complex technical response by North Koreans inside the country to state digital control. In the past, a lot of the ways that North Koreans have sort of used technology has been more sort of circumventing controls, getting around them or using devices in a way that just nobody thought of. This is a little bit more of a direct attack against the controls themselves. So we think that's interesting. And I think it's something that I expect to see more of in the future. North Korea is encouraging a lot of people to study computer science. There's a lot of Android programming going on in the country. And a lot of these computer scientists are going overseas. And when they go overseas and come back to the country, like the first chap that we spoke to, they do bring apps with them and new knowledge that in the end might be turned against some of these government controls. Now, I do want to, I don't want people to get the wrong idea here. We're not saying that there's a sort of large underground hacker resistance in North Korea or anything like that. I don't think it doesn't seem to be particularly organized at the moment, and I would be surprised if this is very, very widespread. But certainly, I think this is all evidence that we're seeing the first sprouts of something like this starting to form. How it develops, we'll just have to wait and see. It's been difficult in the last few years to get a handle on what's going on in the country because there have been so few people escaping due to the COVID border controls. But we're certainly going to sort of keep looking at that. Also, I think, North Korea is going to continue embracing new technology. So we're going to see more of this, not just on cell phones, but in other technology as well. Technology is viewed as important to push the economy forward. And helps out, in the quite significant regional differences inside North Korea, where it's difficult for people, on the most part, to even travel from province to province. So technology helps to sort of level that out a little bit. Also, North Korea recently created a Ministry of Information Industry, which I think is another sign that this IT push isn't slowing down. Before I finish, I just wanted to mention a couple of other things from this new law that I think gives a sort of indication to some of the issues in regards to information control that the North Korean government's facing at the moment. There were a bunch of new fines and penalties aimed at individuals, but also some aimed at companies and organizations. And that's something that we haven't necessarily seen so much of in the past. So it does point to some companies disobeying laws, not just individuals. A couple of examples. One is that TVs and radios that come in from overseas are required to be inspected and modified by the state so that they can't receive foreign broadcasts. And PCs are also required to have monitoring software installed. There's a new fine in the law, 50 to 100,000 won for individuals, but 1 to 1.5 million for companies that ignore the rules. So it raises the possibility that companies are either importing for distribution or importing for themselves devices that then they're not registering with the government. And then finally, there's a similar fine for workplaces that allow foreign content to come in by not properly monitoring staff use of computers or controlling an internet connection. While the internet is almost unavailable in North Korea, there are some official uses, and in some instances, companies that are doing international trade or perhaps research establishments do have internet connections for their work. And this sort of seems to hint that maybe those internet connections aren't being as properly monitored as the government wants. And that's why there are now these new laws and fines that have come in against that. So all of this is in the report. I think we're going to put up a link to the report. We have a Korean language version as well. Niklaus has provided some examples of the Android code that he talks about. And then there's a supplement that talks about all the sort of current and former North Korean smartphones and companies in there as well. So thanks for listening. I look forward to your questions, and I'll pass it back to Natalia.
Great, thanks, Martin. And yes, we're going to put links to both of the reports in the chat. Great. So thank you once again for that insight and that information on your report. So let's move to Stephen and Peter to introduce their findings.
Super. I'm going to start this slideshow here. Everyone can follow along. We do have a slide deck. I trust everyone can see that all right?
Okay. Yep,
well, again, good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, depending on where in the world you are. Many thanks to Natalia Slavny, Martin Williams, and the Stimson Center for organizing today's event. From now on, Peter and I are going to present some selected findings from our recently completed research project on the determinants of foreign information use and sharing in North Korea, as is indicated by the title of this presentation. The research presented here was part of an NED-funded research project on information dissemination in the DPRK and constitutes the bulk of insights delivered in our report, for which there will be a link provided, I understand. And that report that will be provided is the one we tailored for NGOs. We also have a longer report and a working paper, which we'll reference at the end. So let us begin. Here's a presentation roadmap of what we're going to do together here today. We're going to Peter and I will be exchanging presentation duties. Oops. Peter and I will be exchanging presentation duties. I'll start with a brief overview of the project objectives that we set out to achieve. Peter will then provide some context on the North Korean information environment in which our study is situated, including a note on the broader research to which we are contributing. He will then also review our research strategy with you. I'll then take you through some of the main research findings, and Peter will then conclude the presentation. So first up, project objectives. Two broad objectives that we sought to achieve in doing this research. The first is to explore the determinants of foreign information dissemination in North Korea, which includes both the use and sharing of illicit foreign content. After concluding that, we took the data that we collected, some of which you will be presented with here today, and the insights derived from that data, to determine how these data insights can be used to assist NGOs and other organizations that are preparing and sending information into North Korea for information use. And with that introduction to the project, I'm now going to hand the mic off to Mr. Peter Ward to give you some context about the study.
Thanks, Stephen. Yeah, so I will begin by telling you a little bit about, hello everyone, sorry, it's a bit late here. I will begin by telling you a little bit about, briefly introduce the North Korean information environment. So, can we have the next slide, please, Stephen? Or can I? Thank you. So yeah, a lot has been said about authoritarian information environments in general within the theoretical and empirical literature on comparative authoritarianism and on civil societies under authoritarian rule. The North Korean information environment is of great policy relevance, actually, not only to us in the Western world and here in South Korea, but also to the North Korean government and the North Korean people. The North Korean, as Martin was talking about earlier, the North Korean government is very worried about the issue. Daily NK reporting the reporting of other media organizations looking at the North Korean issue has shown that the North Korean government has taken an increasingly aggressive stance towards the dissemination of foreign information and foreign media content, not least with the adoption of the Reactionary Culture and Ideology Exclusion Act, which Martin was talking about earlier. But you can see many references to the dangers of foreign information elsewhere in the North Korean official publications. Like, for instance, an instance I always like to point to is the revised Korean Workers' Party history, which makes highly disparaging references to Radio Free Asia. Yes, in spite of the fact that the topic is very important and of great interest to academics and policymakers, there's surprisingly little research on the North Korean information environment, specifically on how North Koreans acquire information and contents from foreign sources and about the outside world. I mean, we have studies done by USAGM, that's US Agency for Global Media, and Unification Media Group here, but not very many surveys have been done of such type. And while they offer rich insights about how North Koreans acquire, consume, and distribute information and contents, they have some methodological limitations that we tried to address with our current study, specifically in how North Koreans make choices in situ about whether to consume or not consume foreign information and contents. So next, I'm going to tell you a little bit about the research strategy we employed. We used what is called a choice-based conjoint experiment to look at how North Koreans make decisions about information use and consumption and distribution. This method is actually very widely used in market research and was pioneered in the 1980s for such purposes. I believe it's the 1980s, and continues to be widely used in industry and also now in the social sciences. In addition, we asked direct questions of our respondents regarding information use and sharing. We think the questions we're seeking to address about information dissemination and consumption are intrinsically interesting, but we also hope that through our use of an innovative research design, we could help NGOs interested in seeking to help the North Korean people. So we worked with an organization in South Korea called Urion, which specializes in North Korean resettlement and human rights issues and refugee survey logistics. And we recruited 313 North Korean refugee respondents. We sought to recruit, refugees or North Korean defectors, depending on which term you prefer, who had recently left North Korea and resettled in the South to best capture recent information dynamics, information sharing and distribution dynamics inside North Korea, and limit the effects of migration on preferences, memory, and the like. Nearly all of our respondents arrived on or after 2015, and we're happy to talk more about our sample and recruitment methods during the Q&A if you're interested. As an aside, Urion was recently mentioned, was actually recently the subject of an article in the Washington Post early this week, but yeah, we knew them before they were famous outside of South Korea. So respondents were, here we are. Respondents were shown a pair of were shown multiple pairs of profiles composed of 7 attributes with varying levels. We'll show you the levels and attributes on the next slide, but for each pair of profiles, respondents were asked to choose one of the 2 that they would prefer to consume. They were asked to assume that they were still in North Korea when making the choice, and each respondent was shown a total of 10 unique randomly generated profile pairs. And after the seventh pair, respondents were also given the opportunity to explain why they had made the choice that they did in a longer form text answer. So yeah, here are the attributes. Each level for the attributes as well. So we've got provider, we've got distribution media, content form, type, acquisition place, content subject, and target age. And as you can see, all of the attributes except for type have 4 distinct levels, and each attribute and level was workshopped with stakeholders and focus grouped with North Korean refugees before the survey's rollout. So I'm just going to pause here for about 15 seconds so you can have a look, and feel free to screen cap it for later. We have an exercise for which input from the audience using these attributes will be requested. Okay, well, I hope you've screenshotted that. Is that 15 seconds? Stephen's smiling. Okay, let's go on to the next slide, Stephen. Yeah, so here's an example in English of a pair of profiles that a respondent may have been shown. Underneath the conjoint, respondents are asked to choose between choice 1 and choice 2. I'll pause again to give you a chance to consider this example of the experimental design. I think we can go on to the next slide. Okay, and here's what the respondents actually saw when doing the survey. So now, I'm Peter. Stephen's going to tell you a little bit about the findings from our survey.
Thanks for that, Peter. I hope everyone got a chance to take in what we've done. We'll have an opportunity to go back during the moderated discussion and the Q&A if you want to take a look at this again. And like Peter mentioned, we do have an exercise, for a dynamic exercise that will involve the panel and or the respondents to understand the use of this experiment and kind of the mechanics and how it worked. So again, I want to note, we're only reporting here the determinants of foreign information use. We did look at some other things, but we're focusing on use and the main results from the experiment that Peter has explained to you thus far. And so the results will focus on the results, on the findings of the choice-based conjoint, this design, experimental design that Peter just went through. From here on out, I'm going to show you 3 graphs that report this thing called marginal means. I will explain what that is so you can understand what I'm showing you for each attribute level. And then we're going to consider the least and most likely profiles that North Koreans would use according to the data that we collected. What motivates foreign information use? Let's take a look. Okay, I'm going to explain what this is, and I'm going to walk you through it from the top to the bottom. So first, we're going to look at the marginal means for provider and acquisition place. These, as we discuss in a lot more detail in the working paper, these are the 2 main quantities of interest. We might get into this during the moderated discussion, maybe in the Q&A. We'd be happy to explain why these are the 2 main quantities of interest, but we won't get into that now. Let me explain, though, what each data point here means. It's a marginal mean. A marginal mean or marginal means are descriptive and intuitive ways to represent the results of a conjoint experiment. They represent the mean outcome across all appearances of a particular conjoint feature level. So one level, that would be stranger, neighbor, family, friend, averaged across all the other features. In a forced choice conjoint design of the like of which we've employed here, with 2 profiles per choice task, the marginal mean by definition will average at 0.5. with values above 0.5 indicating features that increase profile favorability, and values below or to the left of the 0.5 line here, indicating features that decrease profile favorability. We can see here then that for the provider, stranger and neighbor are to the right of the 0.5 line. That is, if a profile has these attributes, stranger and neighbor are to the left, that makes them least likely to be chosen. So this means that if these features appear in a hypothetical profile, that profile is less likely to be chosen, or less than 50% of the time that profile will be chosen. Friend and family, on the contrary, are to the right of this line. They're closer to around 55%. That means they're more likely to be chosen. In other words, it motivates acceptance, or in this case, an indication of favorability for this foreign information profile. We see here that for acquisition place, that is where the information is delivered. Information that is provided in an outside place diminishes the likelihood of use, whereas information delivered in a home motivates its use. Notably, markets are a bit of a wash. On average, market-based information exchange is not likely to motivate or discourage the use or as we could explain, the further dissemination of illicit foreign information in North Korea. So let's go on to the next ones. Next, we see the type of distribution media used, subject, context, and delivery form. We see here that foreign information on a USB motivates use. Maybe that's not a surprise. This is a very popular medium of information delivery, and you can see that as a result of our findings, it motivates the use of the hypothetical foreign information profile that was shown to our respondents. Foreign devices, on the contrary, discourage it. Then information with the South Korean content, for the next attribute there, is preferred, and North Korean content is not. Probably not a big surprise. Lastly, on this slide, we note that respondents are moved to choose information with video content. That is the one point on the content form information attribute there that motivates its use. We will bring all this information together here shortly as a recap. So if this feels like a lot of information, stand pat, I will bring it all together for you. Finally, we find that respondents on average prefer content targeted towards younger audiences. Now, we kind of went back and forth when we were just determining whether or not to include an age sort of focused target age, because won't older folks want older folk material and younger folks the same? So that is matching their age group. First of all, people, and those especially who are interested in putting together these information profiles, were interested in including this. So we obliged the request and included it. And if you find, or when we look at this by subgroup analysis, so we just look at older respondents and younger respondents, we find that that which targets youth is generally preferred because it's probably associated with the type of material that's more desired. Finally, we find that for the type of information, fiction and nonfiction, that nonfiction is preferred. That is to the right of the 0.5, it is more likely to motivate information profile use than is fictional material. So now let me kind of bring this all together in a more substantive way that can maybe, that will perhaps help you put it all together. So what I'm showing here is the hypothetical foreign information profiles least likely and most likely to be chosen. You can see that an information profile provided by a stranger outside on a foreign device with functional North Korean content in text form oriented for an older audience is not particularly desired. What might this be? I could say a digitized North Korean story about the exploits of Kim Il-sung, perhaps, or some such thing. This has about a 20% probability of being used as per our data. On the other hand, or the other end of the distribution, that which is most likely to succeed, according to our information here, you see that a nonfiction, foreign information about South Korea provided by a friend on a USB stick in the home of the recipients is going to be consumed or used about 76% of the time. This is what the people want. So before Peter brings us home and sort of concludes and summarizes everything we've talked about here today, let me recap what we just learned. First, people prefer content from friends and family delivered at home. Second, information presented in an outside space is not preferred. They don't want it. Third, videos meant for a younger audience are targeted to a younger audience cohort on a USB stick with South Korean or international content is desired. Lastly, factual content is preferred over fiction. I will now pass the baton back to Peter to conclude our presentation.
Thanks, Stephen. So yeah, let's have a quick look at our key takeaways from the report. North Koreans want information about and entertainment from the outside world in spite of the risks, and they're especially interested in information rather than just entertainment. The state looms large, however, in the lives of North Koreans, and safer locations like one's own home or someone else's home rather than outside spaces, or to a less extent markets. And information or content from those to which they have intimate ties with is preferred. This is a low trust society. People do not trust their neighbors or strangers with politically dangerous activities like the consumption of foreign media. Any strategy looking to support its consumption and distribution inside North Korea must account for low levels of social trust. And yes, I should explain what these are. These are the two outputs from this project. On the left is our report for NGOs, and on the right is the white paper that is currently under review that we produced using our survey material. And I will leave it there and pass the baton back to Natalia.
Okay, great. Thanks, Stephen and Peter, for showing all of the information. So I understand that the two of you have also created an application that you've alluded to in your presentation regarding information dissemination strategies. That's something that NGOs can use. Are we able to pull that up on the screen so we can take a look?
Yes, I will do that right now.
Great. So can you tell us a little bit more about the application, why you've created it, and why people and organizations should use it?
Yes, what this application is, what it tells us, why they should use it. So this application is, it's using the conjoint data programmed into what's called a Shiny app, which draws upon data you feed into it through RStudio in the case of what we've used. And what it will tell us based upon toggleable inputs from the attribute levels is the probability that that information profile will be used or consumed as per the experiment that we ran. This has, I think, two uses as we see it. The first is sort of a general academic and or general interest use for those who want to understand how information is consumed and what you can learn about North Korean society, trust between peoples, the impact of the role of state monitoring and state control for information flows in North Korea. Two, it was created, in fact, to advise those organizations which put together information profiles to send into North Korea, not as the tell-all definitive take on what will work, but to help them calibrate their strategies based upon the input of those who actually use the information in North Korea. So it's a guide, it's a model. You know, all models are wrong, some are useful. We hope this one is useful insofar as it can help guide or advise how this information is being assembled and subsequently sent in to North Korea.
Great. Thanks so much, Stephen. So we've put the link to the application into the chat if people want to take a look while they're reviewing your report to kind of see how everything fits together. And of course, for use for organizations in this kind of modeling to see what could be more effective. Great. So everyone's discussed the myriad of different technology used to disseminate and consume foreign information in Korea. We've looked at smartphones, Wi-Fi, tablets, SIM cards, many more. And then there are lots of things that citizens are doing to bypass these controls in order to get a hold of this information. So it's not an easy task. And they're going to share it and continually evade government restrictions and punishments. It's truly what Martin has said, a cat and mouse game. So I'd like to begin the discussion with a question, starting off with Peter and Stephen. For your research, it seems like both the place where content is provided and the person who provides it is extremely important. Can you extrapolate a little more on that?
Peter, I'm going to have you address that one if you don't mind.
Sure. So can we put the attributes on screen? Is that all right?
Yeah, I can
just make it. Yeah. Thanks, man. Wonderful. So basically, we operationalized this concept of social capital, or social trust, rather. We operationalized it in two ways. We looked at who the provider was and the place where the content was acquired. And we assume, I think fairly, that family and friends are, people who you have particular and intimate relations with, and who you're more likely to trust with more things, such as politically dangerous activities. And you're more likely to feel safe in your own home or in another person's home who the provider's home, if that provider is someone you know well, than you would in, say, a market or outside. The basic logic of this is that in North Korean society, markets are to some extent within marketplaces, not market transactions or market prices necessarily, but marketplaces are to some extent under the control and surveillance of the state, as are a lot of outside spaces, whereas in most houses are not routinely surveilled and or bugged. The state doesn't have the capacity to do that. And relations with foreigners and neighbors can easily be compromised by North Korean social control institutions, but people are more likely to trust their family and friends, and they're less likely to assume or believe that their friends are working for the state in trying to curtail or surveil them with respect to foreign media use. So those are basically that's what we those were the things that we took away from the results that we got in these areas.
Okay, and then building off of that, during the coronavirus pandemic, there's been reports that some unsanctioned 장마당, like black market activity, has been dampened due to reduced trade and crackdowns on foreign imports and quarantine periods, and these new laws that Martin alluded to as well. But many people believe that markets play a pivotal role for disseminating information and foreign things in a civil society such as North Korea. So what do your findings say about this assertion in the role that markets play?
I mean, I think we need to distinguish between trade or transactions between individuals or entities and marketplaces as spaces. Marketplaces in North Korea, officially sanctioned marketplaces, these sort of literal concrete structures, or trading sites by the side of roads, are contested spaces where the state is trying to assert and maintain dominance over the economy, but also over the North Korean people. Whereas market transactions and trade amongst individuals can occur in any of a number of different spaces. You know, people can trade in their own homes, they can trade in other people's homes, they can trade in parks, they can trade in restaurants, and they can trade over the phone. And these spaces are contested, but to a lesser extent. And you can certainly trade or disseminate information through market transactions and through commercial networks, but marketplaces may not be the optimal way to do that. Is, I think, one of the key takeaways from our report. They may actually, in certain contexts, but they may not be. And we need to distinguish between market relations and commerce and marketplaces as physical sites.
Okay, great. Thanks, Peter, for that distinction. So we've actually got quite a few questions in the Q&A box, so I think I'm going to start pulling from there. One I see from Rudiger Frank that Stephen has mentioned will be addressed. Question to both Stephen and Peter. Some of your results seem to confirm what we already assumed from anecdotal evidence, experience, or common sense. So please tell us whether there were any unexpected results, and if so, which ones do you consider most important?
It's a good question. First, it's always good to corroborate what we find to be anecdotally true. But to the question more specifically, was within the findings that we had, was there anything unexpected and or particularly interesting, or unexpected and interesting? There was some, yes. Let me list a few of them in no particular order. I think that people prefer nonfiction over fiction is a bit of a surprise. I think we generally assume that people want to view things such as South Korean dramas, international Disney production dramas, when in fact people, at least among those who we were able to survey, do prefer nonfiction. And this also comes out in the qualitative data that we collected, these open texts that Peter mentioned that the respondents were prompted to fill out after the 7th profile they viewed. They filled these out pretty substantively, which was very useful. We didn't get into that just for the sake of time and space. That's one. Two is we don't share it here again because of time and space constraints, but in exploring what motivates information sharing, which was an additional question asked after the information use following the hypothetical profiles, what we find is that, of course, as we showed, North Korean content, it discourages information use. People aren't interested in it for a number of reasons. Some are obvious, some are probably personal. However, if North Korean content is provided by a friend, it does tick more towards the side of use with sharing. So if they do use this information, we then ask them, who would you share this with? We didn't get into this in the report, so I'm just talking about it now. So they said they would use this for an information profile. Okay, with whom would you share it? Unsurprisingly, they're more likely to share it with friends or family than a stranger or a neighbor. But if it's North Korean content, it's not particularly preferred. But if it comes from a friend, it has a noticeable effect. We get into this in the working paper a little bit, which seems to suggest to us, we have no way to sort of confirm this, that explicitly anti-regime content, say anything that's focused on North Korea that's coming from a friend is most likely to be shared. So anything that was particularly sensitive, discussing the qualities of anything regarded the Kim family or the North Korean regime from a friend is more likely to be trusted and passed along. Third, I think we were a little surprised to see the fact that stranger neighbor kind of come out the same. And I think that really underscores just how large the state looms in North Korea and how disruptive it is of social ties. More abstractly, it's squashing civil society or preventing its development, because only state-sanctioned ties are those which are approved or permitted, so as to prevent, in the case of information, the spread of information, and by the state's own paranoid logic, everything that is anti-state. So those are some of the perhaps less intuitive findings. I don't know if Peter wanted to add anything more to that, or if we wanted to continue on to get some questions to Martin.
I'd just like to underline two things you said, because I think they're really important. First of all, the fiction non-fiction finding is quite surprising and counterintuitive, because the narrative about this is often centered on the idea that North Koreans consume foreign content for primarily entertainment purposes, and the idea that actually there would be a preference for information and non-fiction content over fictional content is quite interesting and a bit striking. For me, the other rather remarkable finding, and I think Martin may have something to say about this as well, because it is quite counterintuitive, at least to me, is the idea that people would actively dislike foreign devices as a distribution medium. So they would rather a USB or a memory card than, say, a foreign laptop or a foreign mobile or a foreign tablet. And to me, that seems quite counterintuitive. But yeah, with regards to neighborhood as well, it's just something that's worth underlining. Neighborhood institutions in North Korea seem to have a dramatic effect on people's preferences that really needs to be considered in these matters. But I'll leave it there.
Okay, great. Thanks, both of you. So a lot of questions, a lot of great questions coming in. I'm seeing some. Let's see, Martin, another question from Rudiger Frank. This one's directed at you. You've examined the hardware and the software of North Korean mobile devices, such as smartphones and tablets. How much of the hardware is North Korean and how much is imported? Or which hardware components does the North Korean industry produce domestically?
Yeah, and there's actually another question here, a very similar one from Joseph Lim about the factories where North Korean phones are produced. So I'll talk about both of those together. All of the smartphones that we've seen in use in North Korea, in fact, all of the advanced consumer electronics is not made in North Korea. It all comes from Chinese manufacturers. In fact, that Pyongyang 2425 phone that we were looking at comes from a now, I believe, out of business Chinese manufacturer. But the company specialized in making Android cell phones that it could sell to companies around the world to put their name on. So coincidentally, almost the exact same cell phone is on sale in the US and in Europe, or was on sale in the US and Europe, because American and European companies were also shopping at the same Chinese company. So that's what we see mostly. If you look at the report, there's a supplement to the report that details all of the North Korean handsets that we know about. It's 20 or 30 phones or something like that. And for a few of them, we've been able to identify the company that manufactured them, always a large Chinese cell phone maker. And we do mention the sort of North Korean cell phone brands that exist. I think there's now 5 or 6 different brands. But it appears that what these companies are doing is going to China, bulk buying these phones, and doing a small amount of specification on the phones. There's usually a little bit on the basic model of phone that each customer can determine, like the amount of memory or something like that. So they'll do a little bit of customization on the phone that way, and then supplying the software. All of the North Korean phones that we've examined and seen run Android. Android's an open source operating system that anyone can download. What's been added to it are these sort of unique North Korean security applications. So I talked about the certificate system. There's another application on smartphones that takes random screenshots and stores those in the phone for a time in the future when they might be analyzed or something like that. So that software is put on the phone. The companies have their own brands. It appears that each of the companies has a different warranty. Some of them have their own service centers. It looks very much like, these are North Korean phones to the customers, just like, in fact, some of the phones that you and I go into the store and buy appear to be from one company when in fact they're made by somebody else. So it's that model that the North Koreans are using. It's similar for things like flat panel televisions, any sort of relatively advanced consumer electronics. The most advanced electronics production I've seen in North Korea, I've seen photos of a sort of automated electronics production, but it doesn't appear to be anything like a cell phone, which requires quite advanced design skills to get everything so small and compact. It's usually slightly larger devices, maybe radios and telephones and things like that. So that's what North Korea is doing. If you look in that supplement, there's details of these brands, and where possible, we've also located the factories or distribution centers, as it were, where the stuff's put together. But that's all in the report.
Great. It just seems like this kind of research that you're doing, Martin, is very technical and a little complicated. So for your report, which is really a lot of it's focused on cell phones, how hard is it to get a hold of that technology and then to dissect it?
Yeah, so it's always difficult because we can't just waltz into Pyongyang and buy gadgets. Even folks that visit Pyongyang and people that legitimately live there tell us that it's not possible to buy these things. Shops will very often not want to sell to foreigners, or if they do, they certainly don't want the foreigners to take the stuff outside of the country. The devices that we've gotten hold of have been smuggled out of North Korea. They've been not by ourselves. They've been smuggled out by defectors and through some of these established cross-border trading routes, the illicit cross-border trading routes that exist. And then we just when we started doing this report, put the word out that we want to buy one of these phones, and we found someone in South Korea that had had the Pyongyang 2425 phone. So we were able to source the phone from them. But that's how they come out. And one of our big problems during COVID has been that because of the border closure, we haven't been able to get as many phones as we wanted. I mentioned the research began literally a week before border close downs, and we were hoping to get 5 or 6 phones. In the end, we managed to get 1 phone and 1 tablet. So hopefully we can get some more soon.
And then for building off of that, for Stephen and Peter, I see there was a question that was answered about the sample size. Did you find it difficult to gather this kind of qualitative data and to find enough escapees that were willing to speak with you? And then how you corroborated that data to see if it was trustworthy enough to publish on?
I'll start. Peter can add something to that. In terms of like recruiting, there's a couple of things to say here. It's a good question. Thank you. So this is where working with Urian, which is a North Korean defector migrant run organization, which specializes in accessing the community for survey and other integration and assimilation or integration assistance, is really key. Because we didn't just like put this up on a web link and then ask someone to send it to friends. We had quality control measures put into place by Urian, who customized the links to be sent to known individuals who they trusted, who could then give us unique answers. We then worked with Urian's staff to train them in what was being done. Because this isn't a simple survey, it's a hypothetical survey experiment about which we could probably write a short brief on interacting with populations like North Korean defector migrants and using experiments to understand some phenomenon, in this case, how they used information prior to leaving and resettling in South Korea. So it was, I mean, for us, it wasn't hard per se. It was a challenge to get everyone on the same level to ensure that everyone understood, because some people got lost and they needed someone to explain what it was that they were doing and why they were doing it, to make sure that they could give us valid answers, so as to avoid measurement error due to bad survey takers because of misunderstanding or disinterest. So we were able to effectively eliminate that with the totality of with all of our participants. It took a lot of work. It's a lot of effort to do that, certainly, but it's worth it. And I think Peter and I are interested in how we can better improve these techniques for best practices in order to assist the community and to answer pressing questions about the resettlement and life in North Korea.
Great. Okay, Peter, did you have anything to add to that?
Yeah, I would just say also focus grouping the survey before implementation was really, really helpful. It was something else Udion helped us with, sitting down with younger North Koreans resettled in the South to talk about these kinds of issues, and to just sort of, we went through the attribute levels with them. We talked about how they got access to information when they were back in the North, and it was really valuable and fascinating experience, which was really helpful in developing the survey more before we finally implemented it.
Okay, and then I see a question from June to Martin. It seems pretty gutsy that North Korean defectors you spoke to who hacked into their North Korean phones tried to do that while they were still in the country. So what about them in particular do you think made them have such a high risk tolerance? And then I think after you answer, we could also extend that to Stephen and Peter about what you think motivates this foreign information sharing and for citizens to continually circumvent these technological restrictions.
I saw the question. I was actually thinking maybe this is a good subject for a future research study by Peter and Stephen, finding out about these risk tolerances and why people do things like this. For the defectors that we spoke to, the two particular ones that we spoke to, one I think was motivated, or both were motivated to do this, to use their phones to access foreign content, and also just because it was a technical challenge. They talked about, doing this with several phones that they'd owned in the past, not just, one model. So I think it was a little bit of messing around on the technical challenge, but also there was something useful for it. One of the things, when we're talking to them, we said, well, who's doing this? Is this widespread? Is it just you and your friends? And both of them said, it was just them and their friends. That seems mostly because it is a relatively complex thing to do. They both told us how they got these apps on the phone, and they said that in itself was pretty difficult to do. But they did say that, they knew that some people were offering this as a service. For example, give your phone to your neighborhood geek, and your neighborhood geek might, jailbreak the phone for you. The reasons for doing that wasn't always to use it to access foreign information. Sometimes it was a sort of lot more pedestrian or economic. I mentioned that one of the apps on North Korean phones takes screenshots. And this is a sort of, big brother reminder that the state is always watching you, because, be careful what you're doing on your phone, because you never know when a random screenshot will be taken, stored in the phone, and those screenshots can't be deleted. So one of the problems is that as you have a phone, after a year or 2 years or 3 years, the memory in the phone slowly gets filled up with screenshots. So one of the examples given was that people might pay to have their phones, rooted, so that someone can go in and delete the screenshot. So when the phone is sold secondhand, it has a larger memory capacity. And someone else said that one of the reasons is because people want to load a particular game, or maybe like a screensaver or something like that, that comes in an app form and can't otherwise be loaded on the phone. So it's not always for sort of freedom of information and finding out about the world that people are doing this. But it seems to be something that people are becoming a little more tolerant of, although I hesitate to sort of say that with any confidence, because we really only, chatted to a couple of people about this. And, it was backed up with these new laws that came in that I mentioned. But I think it's probably something that we're going to continue to look at in future surveys when we talk to defectors to try to figure out more and more of how common this is and what it's being used for.
And then to Stephen and Peter, talking about the motivations behind dissemination and circumventing these barriers.
With respect to circumventing barriers, we didn't directly look at that issue, but I think it's a very, very interesting one. And the issue of risk tolerance as well, I quite agree, Martin. It's definitely worth follow-up work. I just want to go off on a tangent here. I'm currently writing a lot about corruption in the North Korean military. And one of the things that is very striking about the sources available to me for this work is just the kinds of risky behaviors that North Korean military officers are prepared to engage in, because they believe that even if they are caught, they will be forgiven or let go. And I think that there is a strong belief amongst certain risk-tolerant individuals within the North that they will never get caught, or the chances of them getting caught are quite low. And that is the reason why they would be prepared to engage in such behaviors, especially younger people. I do think that's a hypothesis, though, on the basis of information that I have available on a tangential subject. I don't think everyone by any means is risk tolerant. I don't think every generation in North Korea is equally risk tolerant, but I think that there will be certain subgroups who feel like they have nothing to lose and are prepared to engage in what look to us to be very socially risky behaviors. And that does not, that can take many forms, including the consumption and further dissemination of foreign content. It may seem rather remarkable to us sitting in our warm offices in rich countries, but there are probably more people like that in North Korea than we might suspect.
Great, thank you. A lot of great questions still coming in. Please feel free to enter them at your leisure. Another one, Martin, you've marked for answering comes from Mariah. Can you share any additional information on how unauthorized devices such as phones from China are being used to access foreign information? Do you have any insight into the use of VPNs or proxy servers in North Korea?
So yeah, as far as we understand it, in terms of all of the devices that come into the country, pretty much all of those are being used in offline mode. So they're being used as media players to, accept the USBs and micro SD cards and DVDs and CDs that used to come in, but come in less now, rather than sort of being connected up to a local network and going through a VPN or anything like that. Most North Koreans have most network connections available, if at all, to a North Korean citizen will be a local network connection. And, it's not like a firewall that restricts access. We believe that internet access just simply is air-gapped from that network. Where that does change, of course, is up along the Chinese border. And there is a lot of evidence that people there with Chinese cell phones are catching the Chinese cellular networks and using those, I think, less to consume content. That route is generally used more for sending messages back and forth, dealing with things like money transfers, brokers who are sending messages to families in the South or messages from relatives in the South back to North Koreans and things like that. So that is quite an important communications route. At the moment, it seems like most of the content comes in digitally and then gets passed around, and that's what these devices are used for. But we do know very little about North Korea's sort of intranet. We see screenshots of it. We see it sometimes on state television when they show a computer screen. But to my knowledge, no one, at least with any sort of technical understanding of the way that a lot of this works, has ever been allowed to sit down at a North Korean intranet terminal and sort of, tap away and try to figure out a little bit more about what's exactly sitting behind the scenes. So I could be wrong on that connection, but no one's ever told us that they've been able to use a VPN, and we certainly haven't seen any evidence of that.
Okay. There was a question that I think Stephen might have replied to, but I'd kind of like to bring it back to the open for more people to talk about. But to what extent are foreign governments using this research data to conduct cyber operations? So, for example, supporting North Korean research companies that are violating laws or to provide info to them. And this is open to anyone who wants to respond. It's kind of a
I think I typed an answer in there, which was basically that, I mean, at least, we're not working with any governments or intelligence organizations, anything like that, that are doing anything like that. But in general, any of this research that we do or anyone else does just adds to the general amount of knowledge that we know about what's going on inside North Korea. So some of it might be getting used in that way, just like it's used in lots of different ways. But at least on our side, we're not working with anyone and contributing to any research for anything like that.
Neither are we. I would point to one other thing, though, that's interesting in the question, but also what Martin was saying earlier about penalties and criminal penalties being levied against organizations. We have to recognize that the North Korean state itself is not a monolith. It's not only broken down along institutional lines between competing security agencies, but state-owned enterprises and collective farms are increasingly not really under the state's control in many of their operations. So North Korean SOEs could easily be being used as conduits for foreign information getting into the country one way or another. I think it's more plausible, though, that it would be commercial in scope. So North Korean state-owned enterprises buying foreign devices or distributing foreign content on the side may have happened in the past, definitely, because they've got to pay their workers and managers want to make money too. So if it is a profitable outlet, then they may have done it in the past. But I think it's more likely it's just done commercially because it's much less dangerous than getting involved in some kind of, psyops or espionage activities.
Great. Yeah, we had a couple of questions come in about data on cell phones. I'm trying to find it. Rudiger Frank asked if we had an updated figure on the number of mobile phone subscribers. It seemed to be something around 5 million a few years ago, but wondering if that number has been updated. And then following on that, how many mobile service providers are currently operating in North Korea?
Yes, I can answer that. Yeah, back in the early days of cellular in North Korea, Orascom, the Egyptian company that was co-running the service, it was great. They used to publish quarterly reports and they had a whole page on North Korean subscribers and revenue from North Korean operations and things like that. But that is now a thing of the past. I think the company, went through several mergers or demergers and things like that. We don't get that level of information at all anymore. I think the last time they published figures, it was around 3 or 4 million, I don't remember. Now I estimate 5 or 6 million, but that's just kind of an out of the air guess based on kind of previous subscriber growth and the size of the country. There really is no accurate figure anymore. In terms of the number of mobile providers, there are 2 that we know of at the moment, both 3G. There's Koreolink, which is the provider that is still partially run by Orascom. And then they had a dispute with the North Korean government about getting money out of the country. And as a sort of, to penalize them, the North Koreans themselves set up a second network called Kangsong. And Kangsong is now the second network in the country. A little bit unclear how much of that is a separate network versus uses the same infrastructure. I have a long list of questions about North Korea that I would love to get answered that we've just never been able to find anyone to answer. And that's why when we were doing this report, it was we felt so lucky to find these couple of guys that had been doing computer science and were able to tell us exactly about some of the stuff we were interested in. But yeah, as far as we know at the moment, 2 mobile service providers.
Great. There's an interesting question that I'd like to pose to all of you if you have any information on it. Regarding students from North Korea who go overseas and some companies using technology from overseas. So as far as we know, does the North Korean government place any debriefing of students or workers that go abroad who return? And then do we know of any guidelines or trainings for those who go overseas, or if they've got specific information controls set upon them?
So it depends on who's going, where, when, as in these things vary with time as well. So the North Korean government's policies on these matters are going to be changing. But say, for instance, foreign workers who go abroad will have political education before they go. And when they come back, they will also undergo intensive political education. My understanding is it's the same for diplomats. For trade officials, if they're traveling frequently, I think it's less likely, but it certainly is possible. With respect to restrictions on travel, access to information abroad, yet again, that is a country by country thing. I mean, all workers and diplomats are going to be under very, very heavy restrictions, but say, for instance, North Korean workers in Russia in the past have had more freedom of movement and this is de facto, it's not de jure, obviously under North Korean law, they don't really have that much freedom of access to information, but in practice, a lot of North Koreans living in Russia were able to access say foreign information or be able to travel around relatively freely. This was less the case in other countries where North Korean workers were resident. I mean, obviously, one of the most extreme examples of this is North Korean lumber workers who were, sort of basically practically imprisoned on lumber camps. But yeah, like I said, it varies from time and place and the kind of worker or the kind of person going overseas. I know less about students, I'm afraid. But I imagine there probably were quite a lot of draconian restrictions on them in the past when they were when there were students overseas.
Yeah, I agree with everything that Peter said. I think that's basically most of what we know about this. But I did want to add specifically that the first of the two people that we interviewed, the one that was the North Korean computer programmer that was working in China, he told us that when he was close to returning back to North Korea, he had been tasked with gathering a hard drive full of information that he could take back. There is some internet access in North Korea, but there's not a lot. And the research organization that he was working for wanted him to gather as many PDFs and academic papers and textbooks as possible to bring back into the country, so that they had a sort of local stash of all of this information and knowledge, and also it could be contributed onto the local intranet, which is something that we do know happens. Stuff from overseas comes on, so it can be shared around the country. And that's how he brought in this hacking software. He said that when he brings in the hard disk, also particularly because he's computer literate and knows what he's doing, he's able to make a little portion of the hard disk and hide some stuff for himself on it while he brings in information for the government. And because he's bringing in information from the government, that hard disk is not really scrutinized very highly. So I think he was a sort of special exception there because he knew what he was doing, and he was specifically asked to bring in a hard disk with information.
Okay. We have a question from John Kim about whether there were indications that North Korea's handling of the pandemic was attributed to the effective use of state-controlled digital info, or if it pointed to the reverse. So were these information controls ineffective because citizens were able to discern the truth about the virus, or was it the opposite? And this can be for anyone.
I will say that I think that in terms of North Koreans' access to foreign information, I think the most notable thing that's happened during the pandemic has been this shutdown of the northern border, which was a route for so much information coming into the country. The government had been trying to shut down the northern border for decades and decades and decades, and stuff kept coming across. And what we've actually seen in the pandemic is a reasonably complete and absolute shutdown of that. Now, I'm sure there's a little bit going on somewhere, but pretty much everything has stopped flowing across that border. And in that time, we've also seen border defenses strengthened. There's now, in a lot of places along the northern border, 2 fences, not just 1 fence. So information coming in has been stopped surprisingly effectively, at least information coming in physically on USBs and memory cards and things like that. This leaves North Koreans very little access to contemporary information. Even in the past, when the border was open, old AM and shortwave radio was the only way to get real-time information into the country. The pandemic hasn't changed that, but it certainly hasn't meant that anything else or everything else is coming in less than it was before. So I think that combined with this new law that we've both talked about that have a lot of new fines and restrictions and a lot of reporting from the country, especially if you go and look at Daily NK, they have, for the last year and a half, they've been writing about new crackdowns on foreign information inside the country. There is now, I think, a greater crackdown than we've seen in the last, at least probably since Kim Jong-un has come to power. I don't know, I'm sure information flows within the country, and I'm sure people know the COVID situation overseas. State television reports on the COVID situation overseas, but very often it's on the problems that countries are having. I don't think there's been really very much coverage of vaccines. It's still a lot of coverage of how many deaths there are and how many lockdowns and things like that. But yeah, if anything, during COVID, I think citizens have access to less foreign information coming in. But that still doesn't mean that, the rumor mill and information trading isn't going on as it was before, but there's definitely less coming in.
Great. And then Stephen, did you have a specific question you wanted to ask?
Yeah, for our panel, maybe Martin specifically, maybe Peter knows something I don't know. Who knows? That's possible. With regard to this, to the Ministry of Information Industry, or the Information Industry Ministry, does it actually exist? If so, what exactly is it doing? I know I've seen it's been referenced in both. It's been referenced by North Korean state outputs and South Korean media. And frankly, that's about the limit of my knowledge of this industry that is, as I understand it, charged with like digital infrastructure modernization. So buzzwords, probably a little bit more than that if it's fully functional. What do we actually know about this?
Well, I was hoping to ask you that question. Now, we know that we started seeing the name used, and about the same time, the Ministry of Post and Telecommunications name disappeared. We've also seen a picture of the old Ministry of Post and Telecommunications building in Pyongyang, and along the side, it now says Ministry of Information Industry. It's unclear to me whether the Postal Service has been spun off from that, or if it's just the same thing with a new name. They really haven't written very much about it. And again, because of the lack of escapees during COVID, there really hasn't been a lot of fresh information that I've been able to gather. But I don't know if Peter has seen anything about this or knows anything more about this.
Yeah, so my understanding from just doing a quick Google search is that of South Korean media sources, it may include the Postal Service, it definitely includes telecoms, and then it includes hardware and software development. So informationalization, as it's called in Korean. So basically spreading IT across industry and civilian life, as it were, and obviously the military too. But it's think of it as a souped up version of the telecoms ministry with extra IT functions.
Okay, we have a question from Irina, which I think ties into some pretty timely information, especially since back in 2020, South Korea passed laws prohibiting NGOs from sending leaflets and technology across the border. So she asks, to what extent do you expect the dissemination of illicit information to rise with time? What would be the first signs that this would evolve into something more widespread for the purpose of resisting the regime's information controls? This is open to anyone.
Let me say something on that. The consumption of illicit information and the desire for illicit information inside North Korea, I mean, illicit, of course, illicit from the government. There's nothing illicit about what is being sent in. It's movies and TV shows and things like that, but illicit in the North Korean state context. Has been rising and rising ever since the first VHS machines went into North Korea in the 1990s, probably, or 80s, 90s. And it continues to, the desire for it, the demand for it continues to rise. It is getting easier for this information to be sent around, because instead of now sending in a VHS cassette or a DVD, it went onto USB sticks, and now it's little micro SD memory cards. So it's easier for this stuff to get hidden and to get passed around. Modern technology, makes it easy to put, 20 movies on a micro SD card, whereas in the past you'd get one on a DVD or something like that. So the demand is there. Before COVID, and at least before this recent crackdown, there was also more and more evidence that North Koreans were able to bribe their way out of trouble if they were caught, especially at the lower levels. If it was local police or local authorities that had caught them with this information, they were able to. I mean, the bribes were still quite high. It wasn't, they weren't just bunging them $5 or something and saying no problem. But it was something that was possible to do. So this was becoming something that was, I think quite a regular moneymaker for the authorities, for the police at the lower levels, and something citizens were getting concerned with. There's definitely a crackdown on now, but I think people will find a way around that. And I think people will figure out ways of doing what they have been doing, but, potentially more safely. I don't think the appetite is going to stop at all. In terms of, it becoming something more widespread for resisting these control methods, the problem with anything widespread in North Korea is that domestic communications is still very curtailed. Even if everyone has access to the state intranet, people aren't installing encrypted messengers. There aren't hacking forums where people exchange this information. It's still very difficult for people to organize in any meaningful way. So that seems to be a big hurdle to it becoming anything meaningful in terms of threatening the state. But the desire is there, and I just think it's going to continue and continue. And the best thing that I think there's a question in here from Sean about what can human rights practitioners do to help people. The best thing that human rights practitioners and organizations overseas can do is to continue to figure out ways to send information in and to sort of give North Koreans the kind of stuff they want, which, as we saw in the research from Peter and Stephen, there's some pretty good pointers there into the kinds of stuff that gets passed around and that sort of risk analysis. But maybe you guys have more to say on that.
Yeah, I just add, first of all, what you said about organization is absolutely crucial. One of the main reasons why the North Korean state is so suspicious of and so reluctant to legalize many forms of market activity within and outside of the state is because it is terrified of non-state organizations coming into existence. And that's one of the reasons why North Korean private property rights outside of very limited individual property rights inside the household are not respected under North Korean law, because they do not want to see the emergence of private firms, private organizations outside of the state. But also with respect to content coming into the country, the border being shut down is really, really important. But the longer term capacity of the state to prevent corruption from decaying, continuing to decay and compromise its capacity to stop the spread of foreign information is highly questionable. I mean, the research on corruption has a lot of things to say about public sector wages. But one really important thing to note is if public sector workers, i.e. policemen, in this context, are not paid, they will have to acquire income via other means, including bribery. So bribes will allow them to continue to survive. And yes, it may be expensive, but there will be enough people in North Korea who want to consume foreign content and who are able to pay those kinds of bribes for us to take an interest in the topic, I would say. We should take an interest anyway, but that's another reason for us to take an interest, because it is realistic.
I think if I can jump in, there's a couple more things to think about here. First is to the original question about the bill that banned the launching of propaganda leaflets, which of course include information, including USB sticks, that was passed 2020, end of 2020, I think.
Like June 2020 or December 2020, somewhere in there.
Yeah, it was the end of 20. It was the end. Feels like 2021, but that must have been 2020, December 2020. Yes. It was the timing, which seemed to come from following a demand by Kim Yo-jong to stop the sending of leaflets, a threat, really, that I think upset people, obviously. Maybe putting aside the politics, just maybe not forever, but just to provide a different sort of answer here, which is we don't really have a good understanding of the information and resource exchanges that take place between defector migrants in the South and those who support them and those in North Korea. In fact, this is phase two. Peter, I believe this is phase two of the broader project that we're carrying out here, which is to understand those network ties better, how information is shared, how resources are shared as well, financial and other, so that we can better determine, say, the impact that the leaflet ban might have. Because if I can play devil's advocate just for a moment, there is some evidence that those balloons are not very effective at getting information across. They end up in the sea, they end up in the border zone where no one can retrieve them, and that is mainly symbolic. What's more significant is the border shutdown, because information and materials tend to go through the Sino-NK border. And as we understand it, I think anecdotally, and what we can piece together through defector accounts and anecdotes is that that is obviously the crucial, in this case, land crossing that would support the sending in and dissemination of information that we're talking about here. But we want to understand better, and that's where we're going next with this, where I think we'll address some of these other questions. How could we know? Will the demand for information increase with time? That's a really good question. I'm not really sure how to answer that. I think from what I know, interacting with colleagues who we've interacted with, is that, I mean, that demand to know is pretty much constant. Whether there's a greater demand for foreign content, that's really difficult to determine. But North Korea is an information-starved environment. Everything based on hearsay, the rumor miller is always churning. And so there's a constant desire for better information. How do we know if it ebbs and flows? I think it's pretty difficult to determine. But in terms of information flows, I think that's where we're going next.
Yeah, if we talk about this in market terms, we're not talking about a demand constrained market. You know, there isn't an absence of demand, it's a supply constrained market.
Okay, great. Thanks so much for all of your input on that. We're running out of time, so I just kind of wanted to wrap things up. And Stephen alluded to this a little bit about his phase two, but I wanted to ask everyone to kind of briefly say, what is the next step in your research, and how can, alluding back to Sean's question, how can organizations support this kind of research and North Korean citizens' access to information? Martin, how about we start with you?
Sure. So next for my research is, well, we're hoping to get more devices because we want to, so far, what I mentioned, the different sort of North Korean smartphone brands that there are. And we haven't really had a decent selection of current devices to really find out if the security systems on the different brands of smartphone are common, as in supplied by the state and everyone puts them on, or whether the state simply gives the rules for how they should work, and each company develops their own app and does it in their own way. So that would tell us a little bit more about where some of this control is coming from, and how much of it is central versus at the cell phone maker level. I suspect it's central, but would like to see that. Also, we are continuing to examine this Pyongyang 2425 cell phone that we have that has this USB block on it. We might have found a way inside. We keep coming up with theories, and we've got a good theory that sounds pretty good. So I'm hoping soon we're going to be able to give that a crack. And if we can get inside then we can kind of see what's going on USB and try to figure out exactly what the government has done to block those communications. Sorry, there was a second part to your question as well.
It was more of just like alluding to what organizations can do to help support this kind of dissemination of foreign information into North Korea.
Well, okay, so in terms of dissemination of information and things, that's probably more on Peter and Stephen's side, but I would love to hear from anyone that has any sort of technical knowledge, or is sort of willing to look at some of this stuff, or wants to get involved. And I'm also available to folks that have more questions as well. So yeah, I'm looking forward to collaborate with more people in the future.
So Peter and Stephen, anything to add to that?
Yeah, I mean, with respect to information dissemination strategy, I think we need to be realistic about what can go through North Korean commercial networks. So a lot of foreign content now is very dangerous to be caught with. So looking at ways to allow people with family or friendship connections in the North to get information to their family and friends is probably what we should be looking at more. With respect to the next stage, though, Stephen and I hope to develop what we've already done here to look at those very networks. So family and friendship networks, cross-border between North and South, and also and consider how these kinds of how information actually gets into the country now and how it gets out.
Stephen, anything from you to wrap up, or?
Here to both. I look forward to working further with Peter and seeing what more Martin has to do, or perhaps collaborating sometime in the future. And that if anyone has any questions coming across our reports, the report for NGOs, which is a little bit more practically minded with recommendations and the like, that was linked to here is there. That will be provided by the NED. And I also believe the longer report, which can be found on my website, or you can contact Peter or me, we'd be happy to share it and talk further about the research.
Okay, great. And with that, we're going to have to leave the discussion here because we're out of time. But thank you once again to Martin, Stephen, and Peter for your thought-provoking discussion of your research and findings. And thank you to everyone for such great questions. We were able to get through basically all of them today. So I'd also like to extend thanks to 38 North and the Stimson Center for helping to run today's webinar, as well as the National Endowment for Democracy for supporting the publication of these reports. And of course, for everyone who's attended, thank you so much for tuning in. Have